Rome did not fall in a single day. It didn't collapse under the sound of swords. It didn't burn in one final battle. There was no moment when trumpets sounded and the world knew it was over. What nearly ended Rome came quietly. It came without banners, without enemies, without witnesses who understood what they were seeing. It came as silence. At its height, Rome was louder than any city on earth. Markets never slept. Roads pulsed with soldiers, merchants, slaves, and messengers. The air carried the sound of iron, voices, animals, and ambition. This was a civilization that believed itself eternal. And then, slowly, the noise began to fade. It didn't start with death. It started with confusion. Winters grew longer than memory could explain. Summers arrived late, weak, unreliable. Harvests failed not completely, but unevenly. One region starved, while another barely survived. Roman administrators blamed logistics. Priests blamed the gods. Farmers blamed the sky. No one understood that the climate itself had shifted. The sun still rose, but it no longer warmed the land the same way. Food shortages followed. Grain shipments from Egypt arrived late, sometimes spoiled, sometimes not at all. Bread grew smaller, prices rose, riots flared and vanished. The empire tried to compensate. Taxes increased, rations were adjusted, reassurances were issued. Rome had survived worse, or so it believed. Then the sickness came, not all at once, not everywhere. At first, it looked like ordinary illness, fever, weakness, coughing that wouldn't stop. Soldiers collapsed on marches. Dock workers disappeared from ports. Bodies accumulated faster than they could be buried. Physicians had no explanation. Their remedies failed. Whatever this was, it moved faster than understanding. In some cities, the dead were stacked outside walls. In others, families sealed themselves indoors, hoping the silence would protect them. It didn't. The plague did not care about rank. Senators fell ill. Generals vanished from records. Emperors locked themselves away. Rome had enemies at its borders, but the real threat was already inside its walls, and it did not fight. It waited. As sickness spread, trade slowed. As trade slowed, food vanished. As food vanished, cities emptied. Not because people fled, but because they stopped arriving. Roads that once connected the empire became empty lines across the land. Messages took weeks, then months, then stopped altogether. Rome was still standing, but it was no longer breathing. What made this moment so dangerous wasn't any single disaster. It was convergence. Climate instability weakened crops. Famine weakened bodies. Disease finished what hunger began. Each problem fed the next. And there was no enemy to defeat, no treaty to sign, no battlefield where Rome could prove its strength. This was nature, indifferent and unstoppable. In some regions, entire towns disappeared from records. No mention of destruction, no account of evacuation. They simply stopped existing. Archaeologists would later find abandoned homes, tools left where they were last used, evidence of lives interrupted, not ended in battle, but erased by absence. Silence leaves no monuments. Rome did not fall that night, but that night proved something terrifying. The empire was not immortal. It could be weakened without being conquered, broken without being defeated, ended without anyone realizing it had already begun. And once silence enters a civilization, it never leaves the same. As the empire weakened from within, The sky offered no mercy. Contemporary writers didn't have the language for what they were seeing, but their descriptions survive. Dimmed sunlight, strange colors at dawn, summers that never fully arrived. Crops withered not from drought, but from cold. Vines failed to fruit. Olive trees stopped producing. Something had changed above Rome. Modern science would later suggest massive volcanic eruptions, possibly far from Italy, that filled the atmosphere with ash. Tiny particles scattered sunlight, cooling the planet for years. A volcanic winter, slow and relentless. To the Romans, it felt like abandonment. The gods were silent. The rituals worked no longer. Hunger deepened the damage. The plague had already begun. Malnourished bodies cannot resist disease. Entire households fell ill at once. Parents died before children. Children died alone. Funeral rites collapsed under the weight of numbers. Graves went unmarked. Names vanished. Rome's population didn't just shrink, it unraveled. The army felt it next. Legions once defined by discipline and strength began to thin. Recruitment slowed. Training camps emptied. Soldiers deserted, not out of fear, but because there was nothing left to protect. What good is loyalty to an empire that cannot feed you? Borders remained intact on maps. In reality, they became suggestions, and enemies noticed. But even as pressure grew from outside, the real collapse was happening quietly inside the system. Tax records failed to update. Census counts became guesses. Infrastructure decayed without repair. Aqueducts still carried water, but fewer people drank from them. Markets opened, but fewer hands exchanged goods. Rome's strength had always been organization, and organization was dissolving. What makes this moment so dangerous in hindsight is how close it came to total erasure. If the plagues had lasted longer, if the climate had cooled just a little more, if famine had spread just a little faster, there would have been no Rome left to invade, only ruins waiting to be claimed. In some provinces, Roman authority vanished entirely. Local leaders took control. Barter replaced currency. People stopped thinking in terms of empire and began thinking in terms of survival. Civilization didn't collapse overnight. It retreated. Historians later debated whether Rome fell to barbarians or bureaucracy, to decadence or decay. But this moment proves something far more unsettling. Rome almost fell to nature, and nature does not negotiate. When the plagues finally eased, they did not restore what was lost. They left gaps, entire generations missing, knowledge broken, trade routes forgotten. Rome continued, but changed, weaker, quieter, less certain of itself. The illusion of eternity was gone. That night, the one no one marked on a calendar, Rome came closest to vanishing without a war. Not with flames, but with absence. When the plagues faded and the climate slowly stabilized, Rome did not celebrate. There were no triumphs, no festivals, no sense of relief, because survival is not recovery. It is damage control. The empire that emerged from this silence was not the one that entered it. Cities still stood, but they felt hollow. Streets echoed in ways they never had before. Entire neighborhoods were sealed and abandoned, not destroyed, simply left behind because no one remained to live there. Rome had lost something more valuable than territory. It had lost density. Civilizations depend on proximity, on people brushing past each other, exchanging ideas, goods, labor, energy. When population collapses, so does momentum. The machine still existed, but it was no longer moving at full speed. Knowledge suffered quietly. Crafts that required master-apprentice chains broke when one generation vanished. Techniques were forgotten not because they were inferior, but because no one survived long enough to teach them. Road maintenance declined. Engineering standards slipped. Administrative precision softened. Nothing dramatic, just enough to matter. The empire tried to adapt. New laws attempted to freeze people in place, forcing farmers to stay on their land, sons to inherit their fathers' professions, workers to remain tied to failing systems. It was desperation disguised as order, and it didn't work. You cannot legislate recovery when the foundation has cracked. What followed was not immediate collapse, but vulnerability, the kind that invites pressure. When external forces pressed against Rome's borders again, they found something unexpected, not weakness, but exhaustion. The legions still marched, the banners still flew, the capital still commanded respect. But the empire no longer had depth, no reserves of people, no margin for error, no tolerance for another disaster. Rome had used up its luck, and that is what makes this moment so chilling. Rome survived this near-extinction event, barely, but it learned the wrong lesson. It believed endurance meant immunity. It didn't realize it had already crossed a line. From this point forward, every invasion mattered more, every famine cut deeper, every internal conflict destabilized faster. The empire no longer absorbed shocks, it fractured under them. Centuries later, historians would argue endlessly about dates and causes, about emperors and enemies, about the sackings and the final moments. But those arguments miss the truth. Rome's fall did not begin with an invasion. It began when nature exposed how fragile permanence really is. Because the most dangerous disasters are not the ones that destroy you instantly. They are the ones that leave you alive, but altered. That night, when plague, famine, and climate converged, Rome stood closer to non-existence than at any other point in its history, closer than during any war, closer than during any rebellion, closer than during any siege. And no one watching at the time understood what they were witnessing. There were no speeches, no warnings, no records declaring, "This is the moment everything almost ended." History rarely announces itself. Rome continued on for centuries after, but it never returned to what it had been before the silence. Something essential had already been lost. And here is the most unsettling part. Civilizations today are louder, faster, more complex than Rome ever was. They depend on systems even more fragile, on balances even more precise, on climates even more stable. Rome almost vanished without a single decisive blow. Just a sequence of natural failures, stacked too closely together, and nature has not changed. Rome did not collapse that night. That is what makes it dangerous. Civilizations that fall violently leave warnings behind. Burned cities, broken walls, dates etched into memory. They teach future generations what failure looks like. Rome's near collapse left almost nothing. No single year to remember, no final battle to study, no clear lesson carved into stone, just absence. After the silence passed, life returned slowly. Fields were replanted, markets reopened, roads were repaired just enough to function. Children were born into a world that no longer remembered how full it once was. To them, this quieter Rome was normal. They never knew what had been lost. And that is how damage becomes permanent. Empires don't die when they lose power. They die when they lose memory. When people forget what stability feels like. When decline becomes familiar. When survival replaces ambition. Rome survived, but it recalibrated downward. And once that happens, collapse becomes a matter of timing. Historians often describe Rome as a civilization that fell slowly. That is true, but it misses the deeper truth. Rome almost disappeared suddenly, not through violence, but through systems failing all at once. Climate disruption, food collapse, disease, population loss, a perfect convergence. And this convergence did not target Rome because it was weak. It targeted Rome because it was complex. Complex systems are efficient, they are powerful, they are productive, and they are fragile. Rome depended on predictable seasons, on stable trade routes, on dense populations, on uninterrupted administration. When just a few of those failed together, the entire structure bent, not enough to snap, but enough to never fully straighten again. This is the part history rarely emphasizes. Rome's later invasions succeeded because something had already been broken. The silence had weakened the foundation. The wars merely finished the process. And this is where the story stops being about Rome. Because Rome was not unique. Every civilization believes it is more advanced than the ones that came before, more resilient, more prepared, more permanent. Rome believed this too. It had roads that crossed continents, engineering that defied nature, an economy that fed millions, and still it nearly vanished without warning. Nature does not attack civilizations directly. It removes conditions, it shifts temperatures, it disrupts cycles, it introduces randomness. And complex systems respond poorly to randomness. Rome was lucky. The climate stabilized, the plagues faded, the silence lifted, barely. Had any one factor lasted longer, there would be no Roman legacy to study, no empire to romanticize, just ruins with no story attached. History remembers Rome as a fallen empire. It should also remember it as a survivor of something worse, a moment when everything almost ended and no one noticed. That is the most unsettling lesson of all. The greatest threats to civilization rarely announce themselves. They arrive quietly, they overlap, they feel temporary, until they are not. Rome survived the night it almost fell to nature. The question history leaves behind is simple. If it happened once, why wouldn't it happen again?